Okay, everyone. Well, thanks for coming today. I am here with Clark Bates, and Clark Bates is professor of New Testament at Ford's Theological Seminary. He's actually, I think he's getting close to finishing his PhD, University of
Okay.
Birmingham. I'll tell you how far he is. But this is a book, if you can see it on our screen here. Actually, I'm going to do it this way too to help our audience see something here. I have the copy of the book right here on the slide. Just want to see a little more up close. But this is a book called Faith Examined, and Clark is the editor of this book, Clark Bates. And this is a book that is a really written as a compilation of apologetic essays in honor of Dr. Frank Turek. And for some of you who are on my calls and are just familiar with the apologetics world in general, you're probably familiar with Dr. Frank Turek. Very well-known, popular level apologist, speaks on college campuses, does a lot of ministry at crossexamined.org. Very well known. You can see his clips all over the place. But anyway, so this book just came out most recently over the last few months, and this book was a long project, but I contributed one chapter to this book, and Clark is the editor. He has a chapter as well in the book, and then we have some other authors in this book. So we're just going to take a little time today to talk about this book and how we both, or how Clark got the thing going and how he got this book done, and then talk a little bit about some of the content of the book and what we wanted to accomplish with it. So, Clark, welcome. We appreciate you coming on. I know you're in Birmingham, and I have been to London when I was like 10 years old. But what are you doing over there in Birmingham? What got you going the route of New Testament studies? Like, what's your background and what are you doing there?
Sure. Kind of in a distant way. Some of it is owed to Frank, I think, in a lot of ways, because I started out getting my master's of divinity degree with Liberty University at a distance, and was felt like I was going to go into sort of pastoral ministry, but I'd always had a interest in defending the faith, and that's sort of this realm of apologetics introduced me to Frank. But of course, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist and those things, and it was through that I really started feeling more of a push toward that sort of focus of sort of defending the faith. But I kind of came to the impression that maybe pastoral ministry wasn't where God was leading me. And through some prayer and sort of reflection, discussion with my church, and even with my wife, we sort of felt the call more to an academic level of ministry, more of a teaching ministry than preaching. And so I continued to pursue the next level of education, which was a master's of theology and ultimately a PhD. But how it got to New Testament was actually at CIA the first time I went. You know, you get to hear from Frank and others, and like J. Warner Wallace, and one of the things that they talk about is often how to find your lane and sort of stay in your lane. You know, you can't be an apologist that knows everything. It's just impossible. It's like you can't be an academic that knows everything. I mean, you can't even know everything about New Testament studies, let alone everything there is to know about Christianity. And so it was important to identify what is your passion, what is your real interest. And as I reflected on that question, the thing that had always come back to me, the one that always interested me most was the New Testament, or the Bible in general, but the New Testament specifically. And so I decided, if that's where the Lord's leading me, that makes the most sense to make that my focus. And when I was doing actively doing apologetics ministry, I worked on a website and speaking under the name under the operation of Exegesis, which was Exegesis Ministries, which was kind of a play on words of the word exegesis, which is getting the meaning out of the text, and the exe and then Jesus, the name of Jesus. So I did that for quite a few years after going to CIA and working on that, and was doing it in tandem with my studies. And I kind of had to let that go to once I started moving to the PhD, because the amount of work it requires to do that kind of research, you just don't have any free time for anything else. And so it's kind of gone to the wayside for the time being. But yeah, so that's kind of what got me into New Testament studies. When I was in my master's program, I got exposed to how to work with New Testament manuscripts in Greek, and learn textual criticism. I was taught that in Phoenix Seminary from Dr. Peter Gurry, who studied under Dan Wallace, who many of you know, and Dan and I are friends now as well. And that really just that changed everything. I realized that more than just doing the New Testament, I wanted to work with the manuscripts and the history of the New Testament, even how the church used it, because it was a nice connection to the Christian faith, a tangible connection to the Christian faith. And so I came out to Birmingham here to work at the University of Birmingham to get my PhD in a department known as the Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing, or ITSE. The person that runs this is Dr. Hugh Houghton, and he is a fairly renowned textual critic all over the world. He is the editor of the new edition of the Greek New Testament that will be coming out. If you've ever seen the little blue copies of Greek New Testaments or even the red copies, he is leading the edition of that coming up, and he's also been behind some of the major text critical projects that are coming out in the next few years. And so he has a very strong track record of working with students on textual criticism and knows what he's doing. And he made the most sense to work with. And so I've been here for, well, it's been about 3 years now, working under him and learning from him. And I'm finishing up. You're right. I've got about 3 months left to write my thesis, and I did a critical edition of my own on a series of commentary manuscripts of the book of Ephesians, and now I've translated that into English, and I'm writing my own comments on what that contains. So it's a bit of textual criticism, a bit of church history at the same time. It's been challenging, but a lot of fun.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I do have some of those names you mentioned, some of their books. Peter, you said Peter Gunnery, is that yeah.
Gurry, yeah, Peter Gurry, yeah.
Gurry, yeah. I have one of that Scribes and Scriptures book he
Yeah,
has. If that's, I think that's what
excellent
it's
book.
called. So, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to go back to that textual criticism issue towards your chapter in the book later on. But
Certainly.
well, really quickly, when Clark mentioned CIA, a lot of the authors of this book that has been written were graduates of the Cross-Examined Instructor Academy. And I say that right? See,
Mhm.
Cross-Examined Instruct, yeah, CIA.
That's
So
right, yeah.
anyway, I was actually in the first class, which was way back in 2008 or so. I don't even remember, maybe
Yeah.
2009. And so I was like in the guinea pig class. And then Clark went at a class later on. And so they've been doing this
Yeah.
every year. Frank has different apologists help him, and then people from all over the country or world come in, wherever different parts of the country, and they get training on how to do apologetics better, do presentations, interact, and get tips and advice. So that's how a lot of people knew Frank through that. Now, I personally, the way I found Frank Turek was years ago when I was just starting to do campus apologetics at the Ohio State University here. And I started looking for speakers to come to the campus because I wanted to build this apologetics ministry. And I have for some reason I was searching online and I somehow ran into one of Frank's videos. And this may have been before YouTube was even a big thing, but I saw Frank speaking somewhere and I thought, wow, this is really great. This is what I'm looking for. And I think it was just when I Don't Fake to Be an Atheist had come out or close to that, maybe a couple of years after. And so I researched him and then I found him online and then I got his book, and then I realized he was an SES graduate from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and I had just enrolled there to do an online program.
Nice.
So we had some things in common, and so I then had him, or no, then I found out the Cross Examine Academy. I went to that. I was a first class, and then I had Frank come to the campus after that. And ever since from 2009, we've had Frank here about probably once a year. He's kind of like a once a
Yeah.
year guy here, maybe once every 2 years. He's been here 8 or 9, probably 10 times at Ohio State University. So we've regularly used him. He actually gets the best turnouts of anybody we have on
Wow.
campus. And I've had top scientist guys like James Torr and other guys. I've had William Lane Craig, or William Lane Craig I can turn out. But anyway, so I've known Frank for a number of years and watched how cross-examine has grown and how his what he's been doing has certainly influenced a lot more people. So I was happy to participate in the writing of this book. So Clark, was it just one of those things where you personally were so impacted by Frank personally that this gave you the idea for this, like the inspiration to get a book like this written? Is
Yeah.
that what happened with you?
It was kind of it was interesting. For those that haven't sort of seen the book or maybe read the introduction, or I talk a little bit about that with Jorge. Um, this started about 4 years ago, at least. It was before COVID, and I was still living in the United States at the time, and I was really it kind of was that I was moving out of my apologetics sort of career, if you will, and going into full-time academia. And it was a bit of a bittersweet moment for me. And so it caused me to reflect some on it. And it kept coming back to me that if it really hadn't been for CIA or the Cross-Examined Instructors Academy, a lot of that wouldn't have happened. And it was a real formative time in my life. And I knew, guys, I've been how many people have been affected by that. Because obviously, as you go to these classes, you meet other people and you become friends. And I've been friends with a lot of the people that are in this book, but also just followed their track record as they have gone through CIA, and seeing how they kind of branched out after that moment, that I could see that that program really did start a lot of sort of new apologetic careers, or even just get people who were already working in ministry into apologetics, which became a big focus for them. And so I knew if that was true of me and it was true of these people, it's probably true of a lot of people, a lot of others. And in academia, they have this sort of a type of book that you would write for someone at the time of their retirement. It's called a Festschrift, which is just a German word for sort of a celebratory writing. And so you would say you have a professor who's going to retire. You get all of as many of his students as you can who are still working in academia to write articles or chapters for this book, and then it's given to them on the day of their retirement. Now, of course, Frank's not retiring, but it did occur to me
No,
that,
he's not.
yeah, no, probably never. But he probably, I don't know if he'll ever get something like that. I thought about it. So he's given his entire life to this kind of ministry, and he should get something like that. And so I thought, who would be good, or who would be good choices? What kind of people would be good representatives to give him that sort of celebratory honor? And it really struck me that it should be people that went to CIA, because those are the people that Frank has always had this heart for the lay person. He teaches at SES, but he has a heart for the lay people. He wants the people in the pews to learn these things. And CIA is mainly populated by lay people. They come in, they may go on and become apologists, but they were lay people when they got there. And so
Right.
that was just seemed like the perfect idea to me. And then I started approaching you and others that I wanted to pick people from different eras of CIA. They all had to have gone. That was one of my requirements. They had to have gone, and they had to be working either in apologetics currently or in some sort of academic ministry or academic work where they were still using apologetics as well. And so with those requirements, and we got people, like you said, for yourself from the first one, we got Phil Fernandez, who's like a plank owner as well. I think he was in either the first one or one of the early ones. Some people that were there when I went, and Elisa was there when I went first, and as well as myself, and then Eric, I think he might have come after me, or it was somewhere around the same time, and Tim was the same way. And so, yeah, just getting to bring all these people together, and every one of them wanted to do this. I had to turn some people away because the book would have been too long.
Mm.
Yeah, and it became this really great outpouring of support for what Frank did. And honestly, I had kind of a vision for it, and it became better than the vision was when I reflected on it. So I'm just been really happy with it, because it's such a broad scope of different types of approaches from people doing completely different types of ministries, and it really does just show how Frank has impacted so many different people. So,
Yeah, Frank's if I try to talk about his strengths, like why we have him to the campus so many times,
mm,
as you know, his strength is clear communication.
yeah,
And so
very,
that's one of the reasons why we have him back over and over. He's able to take kind of the big things and kind of break them down in understandable ways for people. I mean, I've had William Lane Craig here, and someone said to me after I had William Lane Craig speak and Frank comparing him, well, William Lane Craig was definitely more academic,
yeah,
but Dr. Turek made things more understandable. So you had
yeah,
like two different people, something like, well, I kind of like Dr. Craig a little. No, I love Frank Turek, so everybody's different,
yeah,
but he certainly is able to make things understandable in a clear way. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the contents of the book. So I know we all
sure.
got to pick our chapters and ideas. Did you have to, when we came up with the ideas, I
Mm,
never got to ask you, we came up with the titles
sure.
of our chapters. Were you ever like, no, that sounds kind of, I'm not sure about that, or you need to refine the title or content, or what was your input on
Yeah.
that? Like when people gave you the
I yeah,
idea?
I did a little bit. Most everybody had pretty good titles to begin with. There was a few here and there that I thought, maybe we can come up with something a little more catchy or a little more to the point. I think at one point there was a title that used a person's name in it, and I thought maybe we shouldn't sort of call people out in the title. We're going to discuss different viewpoints and stuff like and those sort of issues. Let's not put it in the title necessarily. But just little things like that. But yeah, everybody really did come up with some really great titles. I think I even and some of my suggestions for title changes didn't accept, and that was fine. This whole editing process, I think, and hopefully it was for you as well with me, was I tried to be cooperative. It wasn't my book. It was it was something we were all trying to do. I was sort of trying to spearhead it and steer it, but at the same time, I didn't want it to be me rewriting everybody's chapter. I just wanted to be trying to give feedback and a little give and take. And so yeah, so sometimes the titles changed, but not too much. I think everybody pretty much got to keep their title mostly. I think. Pretty sure your title didn't change at all.
Yeah, I like the title of one chapter. I don't have enough faith to be a physicalist. Eric
Yeah, that's
Fernandez.
good. That was good.
So, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
really relevant chapter these days because I run into more and more college students that don't believe in free will. I
it's
had one guy
becoming
say
really
he
popular.
got to reject free will. So that is a really relevant topic. I don't, obviously don't
Mhm.
have time to go over all the contents of that chapter, but Eric did a really
Yeah.
good job, and I encourage people to read that chapter because there was a big book that just came out recently. Another guy in neuroscience saying we have no free will. Of course, it's gotten
Hmm.
reviews and critiques. So it seems to be more and more common that people reject free will, and that has some serious
Yeah,
implications. I know that
certainly.
there was a recent debate online between Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, and
Yeah.
one of the things that came up in their debate was free will, and that has been
Hmm.
critiqued for the last week and a half. I see it everywhere. So now you had this chap. We had this chapter by William Su. Is it Suhu? How do you say that?
Yeah, William Suhu. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's got a very technical chapter on the origin
Mm.
of life. A lot of diagrams in here, a lot of stuff is beyond my pay grade. And so this is really impressive. What is his background? How's he able to know so much about this topic? Does he have a science background?
He does, yes. So William actually, I think even currently is still working in California on a bio lab. And so I almost initially I wanted to put all of Williams' degrees titles behind his name,
Right.
just to prove the point. But then I thought about it. I was like, we're not putting anybody else's sort of academic titles, so we won't do that. But yeah, I mean, he has been doing this for many years, decades even, and that's why it was so important to me. I knew this about William. We talked before, and it was really important that if we were going to have someone do a science chapter, that I wanted to find someone who was working in science, that they were in every way a scientist. And so having him on board was fantastic. And you're right. I don't want to deter people because it is a complicated and complex chapter. It's really amazing the amount of information he gives and how it works toward his argument to show you that there's just no matter how you view the origin of life, the time required is just not there. And I mentioned this with Frank actually, and share with everybody else the diagrams in there. I'm still really impressed by this. William drew all those. He drew
Yeah, he
every one
did.
of them. He labeled them all. He created all the art that goes into that chapter. It's all him. And so it
Wow.
was really fantastic to get. And I think if you read that chapter, even if you've never heard of abiogenesis, which is part of the title of his chapter or what that is, you will come away realizing that no, that the complexity of life is just far beyond anything that can come up by chance. It's outside of that range. And so yeah, so I think in some ways maybe people are getting a lot right up front that they weren't ready for, but hopefully they'll walk away realizing that just the data in there is invaluable. And
Yeah, it
then of course you
looks.
have Phil following it up with cosmological arguments. So
Yeah, we had Dr. James Torr speak on our campus on the origin of life about 3 or 4 years ago, and he laid out his case for why, life. He said we're no further along in science figuring out how life
yeah.
could come from non-life than we were 60 years ago. So now he's gotten a lot of debates about that and a lot of things online now, but he laid out a pretty nice presentation
Mhm.
on that issue as well. So yeah, good topic indeed. And then you have the three types of cosmological arguments of Phil Fernandez. My favorite is as far as the cosmological arguments, the first cause, the contingency
Mhm.
argument
Mhm.
that you need a first cause because everything else is contingent. That's one of my favorite
Yeah.
arguments. They're more than the Kalam. I like it better than the Kalam, but
Yeah, and I liked
argument
that
for
about that chapter
contingency.
because a lot of people know that if they're in apologetics, they always hear about the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's a great argument. But most people don't know that there are other viewpoints out there that are maybe nuance that a little bit. And so I thought it was really nice to have Phil share some more historical approaches and give people an idea that there are other options if there's something about the Kalam that you don't think answers a question you have, there might be in these others as well. So.
Yeah, I did want to mention one thing back to Williams' chapter. I forgot to mention, we skipped ahead, is that when you
Mm,
deal with college students and they bring up evolution on campus, which they do because they're hearing it in the
yeah.
classrooms, I always tell them that you can't even get to biological evolution until you've got the right universe, the right planet. Then
Yeah.
you have to get life from non-life. You have all these steps in place before
Hmm.
you even get to the biology part. And they just kind of look at me like, huh, I never heard that before, because they
Yeah.
just skip ahead. They just do. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
yeah,
an
so that's pretty
accepted
interesting.
start point.
Yeah. So, and then you've got a chapter on a life well lived, sustaining value in a battle of worldviews. Alex McElroy, is that how you say his name?
McElroy.
McElroy, yeah, and he
Yeah,
was a CIA graduate, and
he
once
was.
he
Yeah.
just talked. I mean, I just started reading the book myself because I've read some
Hmm.
of the chapters because we've
Sure.
had the going around, but worldview is really important. So
Yeah.
he's pretty much arguing why our worldview makes the most sense of reality in that chapter,
Yeah,
kind
and
of.
with Alex, one of the great things about Alex is that his ministry, his work has been with inner city youth in Chicago for years. So he
Mhm.
works with a church plant as well, but he also has this other side that he does, where he speaks at youth groups. He goes into sort of um, clubs that are for young men, for boys that have no fathers, that they're trying to raise these guys up, and his whole mission has been to show them how life matters, but then to point to why the only way they can know that their life matters because they get hit all the time in their lives with they're not worth anything, or if they are worth anything, they have to come up with it themselves, or they might not make it to live to see 30, so why bother? And so he's really a great example of taking an apologetics mentality down to the street level, quite in pun intended, but down to the street level, and using it in daily life. And so, yeah, he uses this sort of philosophical background to show them how life can only have value. You can only have value if there is a God, because something has to be the objective point from which value comes. And so he kind of walks people through what really I refer to as kind of an intro to philosophy in the chapter, and gives a lot of background into sort of meaning and value and objective values versus subjective truth and things like that, and brings people along. And it works out as a pretty nice introduction to what's going to come in the next two chapters, because it just takes that philosophy level into a different direction. But if you read Alex's, when this was undesigned, Alex approaches several of the same authors and subjects from the starting point that you see Eric pick up and Tim will pick up in their talks as well. So if you read Alex's, you know who Eric and Tim are referring to before you get to them. And like I said, that was completely undesigned. I did not know they were going to have that sort of overlap. It just sort of fell into place that way. I was really, really quite happy that that happened.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, when I talk to college students, a lot of times it's like they want to fight for these social causes, and if they're
Hmm.
atheistic or agnostic, I always say to them, why do you care about people so much? Why do they matter at all if God doesn't
Hmm.
exist? So that's an ongoing apologetic issue to deal with. I think that's a great one. Why do we have value, dignity, rights? And so Eric's chapter, of course, I don't have the faith to be a physicalist, a case for the soul. I've seen some of Eric's talks online. He does a great
Hmm.
job on the soul, knows a lot about the different kinds of dualism and the issue with free will and everything. So that is a very relevant chapter,
Hmm.
and we're like I said, we're dealing with a lot of people who don't believe in free will anymore.
Yeah.
So that I think
I
that's
really
going to be
wanted
a
him to call that chapter
chapter.
Soul Man. He
Soul
wouldn't
Man,
go for
yeah,
it, but I really wanted him
I saw
to.
that movie in
Yeah.
1985, whatever it was. That,
Yep.
but that's an old one. But Eric, I also have Eric's book. What's his book on lazy evangelism,
Yes,
the
the new
lazy
one he
approach
just
to
had come out.
evangelism.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's a good book. You want to get your hands on that. He does just really knows a lot about that topic. So I encourage people to get hold of that because like I said, we're
Hmm.
dealing with people that just don't believe in free will anymore.
Yeah.
They don't understand the implications of that. So
Hmm.
that's very important. And then Tim's chapter on Molinism. Yeah, I had Tim on
Hmm.
a Zoom call a long time ago, maybe 3 years ago. He did Molinism, talked about Molinism. I'm
Hmm.
not an expert on it. I've studied it a little bit, and I know William Lane Craig was the guy who kind of introduced me to it a
Sure.
little bit, just learning about it. But I've seen so many debates over that issue, and Tim isn't really taking that chapter and just strictly dealing with soteriology, right? Like God's
Right.
for
Yeah.
who will be saved. What he's expanding on a little more with that. What's he doing with
Yeah,
that?
I think the nice thing, well, and as you say, with Tim and anybody that's been exposed to Tim's ministry or seen him talk, he is pretty much the man who does Molinism. He wrote his PhD on Molinism, and
Right.
so he has as much of a depth of knowledge of it as anybody you're going to find right now. And so he's a perfect person to have this conversation. And his approach, He is a Molinist. Obviously, he believes it's the best way to approach sort of the sovereignty of God and soteriology and those sort of things. But the chapter is really just trying to point out how it can be a helpful tool in discussing sovereignty and free will with individuals, and how it's to use, sort of the CIA terminology, it's a tool to keep in your toolkit. It's something to have available to deal with, especially as you say, people are talking about the lack of free will, or if God is sovereign. And he determines what's going on, then free will choices can't exist. Well, here's where Tim can come in and say, well, there's this other way of understanding God's sovereignty that allows for both of those things. And so he kind of walks people through that and how that works, but also sort of how, really just how it helps you understand, how it helps you think through the different aspects of sovereignty. What does it really mean? Because I think honestly, if most Christians sit with it, they sit with this, with the biblical teaching of God's sovereignty, it does bring up questions that we have to ask. And we have to ask them of ourselves. We have to ask them of the Bible. And if you get in any kind of conversations with non-believers, and they're aware of these sort of aspects of biblical teaching, or even how it's gone through church history, they're going to have those same questions. And so having an exposure to sort of the Molinistic perspective of, of what we call God's middle knowledge, of his ability to know things that could happen, but what we call counterfactuals, not necessarily have happened, but could happen in any given circumstance, and how that would affect ordering of life, ordering of creation, and all those sorts of things, gives an excellent point to reflect on when thinking through some of these difficult conversations.
Yeah, it is important. I mean, I know students do bring up the issue of God's knowledge and, why did he create Adam and Eve if he knew they're going to sin? Why did he create
Yeah,
Satan? All those questions
exactly.
come up at some level. What about all those people he knows in other countries that don't hear the gospel, all those
Yeah.
things? So it does come up. And, so that's certainly something you need in your tool belt when you're doing apologetics. And Tim certainly knows his stuff about
It
that.
does. Yeah.
So, and then so you kind of start out with the book. We kind of we're using some natural theology stuff, like starting outside
Hmm.
the Bible, doing some stuff, with not doing historical apologetics as much. And then you kind of go into, then we've got some Bible arguments, some things from the Bible we deal with. We deal with Alicia Childers' chapter, The Jesus Hermeneutic, Historical Method or Modern Heresy. I think she deals with Richard Rohr a lot in that
Yeah.
chapter. He's
Yeah.
got some weird stuff out there. She likes to kind of take his stuff on a lot, right?
Yeah, and for those that follow with Elisa's ministry, obviously progressive Christianity has been something she's been engaging with for quite some time now. And Rohr is, for those who aren't familiar, the Jesus hermeneutic is actually something that Richard Rohr, I don't know if he coined the phrase, but it's one he promotes. And this is sort of his mystical approach to the teachings of Jesus. So Rohr is an interesting character. He's I don't know that he's classified as a progressive Christian. I think Elisa is clear on that, but he is definitely used by sort of progressive Christian leaders. He's more of a Christian mystic in a lot of ways. And so one of his approaches is generally to take the sayings of Jesus and show you how he is sort of contravening the Old Testament in a lot of ways, or he's getting away from tradition, away from these restrictions that you might have seen in the old law. And it's that from there that Rohr will jump off from even getting away from the teachings of the New Testament and just focus on the sayings of Jesus from his hermeneutical method, and it can help you decide what is true and what is right in the Bible, and what should be followed and what should not. And so what she does is she takes a lot of that and really just goes right back to the text. She takes what, Rohr's own words, his own explanations of different gospel passages of the sayings of Jesus, and she goes right back to those passages and she walks through everything. As we also hear, you hear in CA. I think it's Greg Kokel that actually made this one famous. But don't read don't read a Bible verse, don't quote a Bible verse. You need to know more than just the verse. You need to have the context of everything around it. So that's kind of where Elisa takes it. She looks at the surrounding context of the rest of the book, rest of the chapter, and she kind of really just shows you how what Rohr is doing is not really anything like what Jesus is doing or what Jesus is saying. It's very selective about how it approaches the text and what it uses. And so she does a very good job of just letting Rohr's words speak for themselves and show you where the Bible disagrees.
Yeah, she certainly is doing a lot of work on a lot of issues. Let me can I just ask a question about New Testament studies since you're in that field? Do most New
Sure.
Testament scholars you think take, I guess it depends on your like if you're like an evangelical or whatever your
Hmm.
approach is to the authority of the text,
Yeah.
inspiration. But do most of them take a view of like Jesus? Like for me personally, like I take when someone says to me, "How do I trust the authority of the Bible?" I always say, once I give an argument for who Jesus is and I establish that he really
Hmm.
has the authority to speak on this topic, I'm going to take his lead on the
Hmm.
authority of the Bible. Now, of course, he's quoting a lot of the Old Testament,
Yeah.
and he promises like the inspiration of New Testament, but do many New Testament scholars take his lead on anything? It just depends on their
Yeah.
it depends their view of Jesus, right? I mean, what they
Yeah, I
believe about
think I think it's going to
Jesus,
depend on
right?
the background. Yeah, I think you'll see that, and certainly in a lot of evangelical academic work and that sort of angle, and certainly sufficient. As we look at who Jesus is, and he is the ultimate author and defender of the faith, and we would want to follow his lead. I think what you will see out, depending on the academics, I would say the broad academic spectrum of New Testament, including secular scholars as well, are not going to even try to defend anything about the Bible. They're not defending historicity. They're not defending authenticity. They really don't even approach it as that. It's more of a text to be studied for what it is. You might find some, like the late Larry Hurtado, who wrote a lot about the uniqueness of Christianity and the authority of the Bible for the Christian communities and those sort of things. And they are out there. Simon Gathercole is another excellent example in Cambridge,
Hmm.
who does that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But in general, that approach doesn't come up. What I would see more often, or at least the approach I generally take with students here in the University of Birmingham, because I speak at the Christian Union from time to time on reliability, is I talk to them about the the just the sort of the scope of your Hebrew Bible with your Christian scriptures, your Old and New Testament, how the overarching themes that connect throughout them, and they all connect around Jesus. So there's sort of this, if we talk about like a connecting pin or a linchpin that makes something hold together, it seems right in the middle you have Jesus, and it all seems to operate and work around him. And it's an impossible, you can't, just as a point of literature, you can't manufacture this. It's not, there's too many different authors, too many different time periods, too many different backgrounds writing without any real connection with each other. There's not a lot of interaction between these groups at the times that they were writing. And so to have this come together in this way, it creates so much implausibility toward this idea that it's engineered, that it's false, and that's to say nothing of the historical details of the text themselves, which are incredibly precise for those that have done that work. Peter Williams at Tyndale House has done some excellent work on that, as well as quite a few other scholars. And so,
Hmm.
looking at the text for what it is, as this compilation of so many different volumes, and how it seems to all operate around Jesus, that if you were to remove the Gospels, none of it would make sense. If you were to remove the person of Jesus, so much of it would be unanswered.
Hmm.
That to me makes a huge impact into how you understand it, and that's generally the approach I take because I'm dealing with students who aren't getting a sort of evangelical background. They're not being taught anything really about the divinity of Christ or anything like that. They might be taught about what people believed about him, but not from any faith background perspective. And of course, this is out here in the UK. It's a completely different culture than what we'd see in America. So that's the approach I take, and I think in general, yeah, over general academic New Testament studies, those are the kind of things that you'll see tackled more than anything. But evangelical academics will still obviously go straight to the identity of Jesus, which is a completely valid place to start.
Yeah. We'll talk. I'm going to pick that up with your chapter. So then we come to my chapter. Does the resurrection of Jesus prove he is the Jewish Messiah? So why did I write about this? Well, hey, I get to tell why I picked this topic. Well,
Yeah.
I'm not Jewish, but I grew up in a Jewish community in Columbus, Ohio, and I came to faith in Jesus in 1994 through hearing the gospel through actually a Messianic Jew. I got invited to this congregation in our city that had a bunch of Jewish believers, which I'd never even heard of. I was biblically literate.
Mm.
I was raised a Protestant nominal kid. And so I heard the gospel from a Jew, and I was like, wow, I never knew there were Jews who believed in Jesus. I thought all my Jewish friends are just like all the Jews. They don't believe in anything,
Yeah.
So immediately I got really interested in Judaism and just understanding the scriptures from a Jewish perspective. And I was immersed in that congregation for a number of years. And then I had a calling, of course, to Jewish people. And as I began to talk to them, over the years, I thought, like the resurrection is the pivotal thing in Christianity. It's like one of the most important things, or if not the most important
Hmm.
thing. But just Jews I talk to. I mean, of course, a lot of Jews are atheistic today; they don't even
Yeah.
believe in God. But the ones that are kind of more orthodox, I talk to, they just didn't really put a lot of emphasis on the resurrection at all. So they'd be like, "Well, it doesn't matter if he rose from the dead; he still didn't do A, B, C, D, and E to fulfill the
Yeah. Yeah.
messianic task." And I'd be like, "Well, what is the messianic task?" And then I started studying the Jewish literature, all the different messianic expectations, and they seem to have
Hmm.
kind of a common theme. Maimonides has some stuff about it, and overall, just the resurrection was never really in it anywhere.
Hmm.
So I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. Like the New Testament authors make the resurrection as like a huge issue, and Paul ties it to Jesus's Davidic line in Romans 1. There's a lot of there, and
Hmm.
so that's why I kind of I got interested in that topic a long time ago. I wrote a book on my own on it, self-published, but I
Yeah.
talked about how I didn't have enough time to put in the chapter, but if you think about it, Jesus rose from the dead. If he didn't rise from the dead, he can't be a priest like Melchizedek forever. He can't be a
Right.
Davidic king forever. He can't be a prophet like
Hmm.
Moses, to do
Hmm.
signs, wonders, and things. So it all ties into that. But also, I just thought to myself, if Jesus helps Israel fulfill their calling into the world, which he's supposed to be, he's their ideal representative, then Israel is called
Hmm.
to reach the nations. I mean, they have a calling to spread the knowledge of God across the world. And so Jesus
Hmm.
helps do that through his calling. He helps 1.4
Hmm.
billion non Jews come to
Yeah.
faith in the one God. Now, that doesn't prove it's true just because of numbers. I'm not arguing for that, like Muslims say
Right.
Islam grows, but there is a prophetic element. To,
Yeah.
you have this Jewish guy come out of the land of Israel and the line of David, the seed of Abraham, and then he's rejected by the majority of his people. I mean, yeah, there's Jews who believe in the
Hmm.
first century. There were Jews who
Yeah.
believe, but overall, he's rejected. But
Yeah.
turns out a lot of non-Jews get to believe in him. So that was kind of like my background on that, just the years of dealing with
Yeah.
Jewish people. And so that's how I'll give my own take on how why I wrote that chapter. So I think it
No,
turned
I
out
think that's
okay
great.
with your help though.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
no,
like
I thought it was good.
yeah, and Clark, like you said, I think when you talk to Frank, that most people probably haven't thought about that.
No, and that's
And
what I
it's a
loved about it
topic.
was, because I said, I was like, I mean, I remember having this, looking into this years ago, but I was like, I wonder how many people ever, who are not Jewish, particularly, okay, so how many Gentiles, if you will, have really ever thought about this aspect of who Jesus says he is, with any real thought. And I love that because, they will hear, as you point out, that there is no prophecy about a resurrected Messiah. So
Right.
how does that play in, and how does that prove? And so that's what I really enjoyed about the way you walked through this, because I remember reading that. I was like, that's a good question.
Yeah,
And
well,
so,
I think that we as Christians are really good at saying Jesus is a son of God or he's this or that.
mhm,
But the Messiah, we kind of say blind, we're like, yeah, he's a Messiah, but we don't understand all the background of the Messiah, what
yeah,
that has to do with. And I think that when you get all these messianic titles like Son of Man, Son of God, Prophet,
hmm,
these things that have messianic connotations, then I think that we don't take that in consideration. And secondly, we don't really know in the Old Testament, like I said in the chapter, there's not a whole lot there about
yeah,
him.
exactly,
It doesn't say when the Messiah comes, he's going to rise from the dead. It doesn't really
yeah,
say that anywhere. And
yeah,
so you have couple implicit things maybe, but overall,
hmm,
there's just not that much there. So I think it's a fascinating topic. The question is, does
yeah.
anyone care? So
Well,
that's
and
why
they
I
should.
decided to
They
write
should.
about it.
I think that's the thing. I think they should care because, even honestly though, even, maybe I don't want to say the majority, because I don't know who, how many different people from different walks of life are going to pick this book up. But, I would say it's probably true that most people are not going to be engaging with Jewish believers or Jewish atheists, maybe or Orthodox Jews or anything like that regularly. So they may not have this conversation, but that doesn't mean non-Jewish skeptics aren't going to pick up on that and realize that this is some other aspect. As I say, I work in academia. The University of Birmingham has one of the largest Islamic studies departments in all of the UK. That does not mean that everybody here is an Islam. The people in those studies are not necessarily Muslim. I'd say a good portion of them aren't, but they are learning. They do understand the Quran. They do understand the history. They've been taught that, and you're going to have that same thing in Hebrew studies. You're going to have people that they may not be Jewish. They may not, have any dog dog in the fight, so to speak, as far as whether this proves one thing or another. But they are going to know that's a problem, and so being able to talk about that, being able to respond to it, not only is good in those situations, but actually it's good for your own soul. It's good to be able to answer that question for yourself. And
Well,
so I
think
think,
about it. In First Corinthians 15, when Paul says, he died according to scriptures, it's like where you think to yourself, okay, Paul makes this like
yeah,
the most important statement, First Corinthians
yeah.
15, but you
What
think of where
scriptures?
is it? What is he
Yeah,
talking about? He doesn't list his scriptures he's referring to, just
yeah.
like Jesus on the Emmaus Road. He doesn't list his scriptures. So
Hmm.
we kind of are left guessing, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so, so that's all we can do. But anyway, well, let me so you talked a little bit about text criticism, and your chapter is called "What Do You
Hmm.
Mean by Reliable?" The reason I like that title so much is because when skeptics bring up "Is the New Testament reliable?" I always say, like, how do we define what reliable
Yeah.
means? Are we talking about
Yeah.
whether the people, the places there are real? Are we talking about the
Hmm.
the text criticism issue has been transmitted correctly? Or do we
Yeah.
mean the contradictions? We can
Yeah.
answer Bible contradictions. So there's so much under that word reliable.
Yes.
Is that what you're trying to do in that chapter? Kind of define what you mean
Yeah,
by that?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it started to occur to me because I'll still listen to debates sometimes on YouTube and that sort of thing, and these will come up about with whether with text critics or whatnot, dealing with reliability, and a lot of times something I kept noticing was the Christian respondents weren't always listening to what the skeptic was saying. They would quickly jump to a historicity argument or they quickly jump to a text critical argument when really what the skeptic was arguing against was not any of that, but really something specific, maybe the miraculous aspects of it. And I can run myself hoarse telling you about the reliability of the transmission of the text. That doesn't say anything about whether miracles actually happened.
Hmm.
And so, the question behind the question in the second part of that title is really getting beyond, first off, finding out what they mean by reliable, which is the kind of the beginning of it, is you need to know what they're asking. So that's where your follow-up questions come in. What do you mean by reliable? What exactly are you asking me? But then understanding that there's a bigger question they're asking. Really, the reliability question is it reliable for me to believe in? Is it
Hmm.
reliable for me to trust in or to even give the guidance and direction of my life to? And that's really a question we ask of everything. It's a question we ask of everything we read, whether it's, secular or religious of some other nature. It's a question we ask of anything we take in and any information that we want to, or worldview that we take on. We're deciding whether it's reliable for us to live our life by. And so, kind of the close of the chapter is really to try to bring people. I try to give some arguments for both, for different reliability questions, but then try to bring it back to remind people: don't forget what these people are really asking. Don't, in most cases, you want to try to point them back to the reliability of it as a guide to your worldview, as a guide to life, because you want that. What we don't want is people to come away convinced that the Bible is reliable, but not believe in it. You know, I know lots of academics that are completely convinced that the Gospels are historical and accurate, but they don't believe Jesus rose from the dead.
As a
And
miraculous
so
presupposition, they're
yeah,
naturalistic.
exactly. Exactly. So, we want to keep that in mind, that there is a bigger question we're trying to answer. You may not always get to that point, but always have that in the back of your head when you have the conversation, because otherwise it will go in every sort of corner that you can think of. I've been there, and it will get farther and farther away from the real message that you're trying to talk to them about. So yeah, so
So
it's,
okay, well, let me build on that. So I'm interested in this. This is one of the most important chapters because, I mean, for me personally, because
mm,
well, one of our campuses we deal with a lot of Muslims, and a lot
yeah,
of these Muslims, some of them are not very educated about Islam,
mm,
some of them are a little more educated, some of them are then educated, just a variety. But they always bring up, the perfect preservation of the Quran, and
mm,
of course,
mm,
I can show arguments against that, with text criticism and stuff a little bit. They don't know much about that, of course,
sure,
but in some cases they don't. But my point is to them is that I don't really know if it really matters, even if I'll grant you the Quran's been perfectly preserved. Let's say it
sure,
has been. It doesn't mean the content in it's true. You
yeah,
know what I mean? Isn't
yeah,
it kind of like, I mean, if we had the Book of Mormon's been perfectly preserved, I mean, there's no archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. So
right.
would you argue preservation for the New Testament is like it's one thing in a cumulative case for like the
Yes,
reliability of the New
absolutely.
Testament? Is that the way you
Yeah,
would handle it?
absolutely. You can't pin the entirety of your faith or your argument on that. I've even pointed this out with the resurrection, and I did this actually the last talk I gave the UCU is like the fact that a man in the first century rose from the dead does not mean Christianity is true. It's all the things that happened around that event, the things that he said, the background to what to even before he was alive, the setting, the circumstances, all of that goes into the resurrection. So I've often asked this to people. I've done this as just sort of to play devil's advocate with Christians, like, well, they argue really effectively for Jesus rose from the dead, and I say, okay, so what? They don't really know what to do with that because they're so certain that the resurrection is that's what you need to do and you prove the case. But I think they're right to a point. But without the context, the resurrection doesn't mean anything really. I can be
Hmm.
skeptical of that. I could even accept it. I could accept that someone rose from the dead. Well, it's okay, sure. That might have. What if someone told me that that happened in Papua New Guinea in 1955 and there was all sorts of evidence toward it? I'd be like, okay, that's wild.
Hmm.
So, that wouldn't mean anything to me. And
Yeah.
so it's a bigger question that's in the same way I can tell you and give you a, innumerable amount of arguments for historicity or textual reliability. And they can demonstrate that these are reliable texts in that regard. But does that get you any closer to understanding if it's true or if what the actual message of the Bible is true, which is this message of fall, sin, fall, creation, and redemption, and the need for a savior and salvation, those sort of things. It doesn't get to that, and
Hmm.
so we want to. It's being able to be aware that there are big questions that we're trying to answer, and these are tools, as we've talked about, as you said, these are parts of an accumulative case, but it doesn't stand on that. It doesn't stand on that one thing. As you said, you could argue the Bhagavad Gita or the Book of Mormon has a perfect textual tradition. That says nothing about the content of the text, you know?
Right. So it's kind of like when we explain, it's like with college students, when I explain to them the resurrection, like maybe I'm giving an argument for, I have to give them the meaning why it's important, like what we believe from as a Christian perspective, the theological meaning, why it impacts our life. Why did Jesus have to rise from the dead? Not just to prove it
Yes.
historically so we can have an apologetic proof. I mean, that
Yeah.
can be, but we have to go deeper and explain why he had to rise from the dead to give us brand new life. Like we need an infusion of eternal life because
Mm-hmm.
we need brand new life. And so, and other things too. But the point is that, yeah, we have to go deeper than simply the historical heart carving out a historical argument, because you're right, someone could just be like, yeah, it's pretty convincing, but then they could say like, yeah, whatever, it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
but
Okay.
I'm just gonna it's like Bart Ehrman. I feel like it comes to historical and miracle claims, the New Testament, like, he's just kind of like agnostic. Or now I mean, I know he's
Mm-hmm.
an atheist, but it's just like some people just stay in their agnostic land. They don't have that
Mm-hmm.
push. And grant the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit has, they don't have that push to see, yeah, like I
Mm-hmm.
need to deal with this, kind of like versus just sitting there
Yeah.
on the fence forever. So,
Yeah.
but would you say in textual criticism that I just read a book, 40 Questions on
Oh yeah.
Textual
Great book.
Criticism.
Good book.
Yeah. And that really helped me, help fill in some gaps for me. I've always dabbled in it, but I mean, I'm not an expert. I just read the
Mm-hmm.
scholars like you guys you're dealing with. But so we have variants. We have these variants, which isn't a bad thing because we just have so many manuscripts,
Yeah.
obviously. But the variants, is it really true that the variant readings may have a scribal error or may have a spelling difference
Mm-hmm.
or a word missing or something like that? But of all the variant readings we have, does it really change the meaning or
Mm-hmm.
anything
Mm-hmm.
really significant, as Bart Ehrman likes it
Yeah.
out to be? Even though he says it doesn't, I don't think, in his book
Yeah.
Misquoting Jesus. So
Yeah.
what's the truth about that? Because sometimes he might overstate our case
Mhm.
or
Yeah, I
understate
think
it. Where do
we,
you
yeah, I
stand
think
with
it's, it
that?
depends. It really depends on what we're trying to say. So yes, there are variants. So for anybody that doesn't know, where variant reading is really anywhere in, if you have two manuscripts and one reads a certain way and the other one reads a different way, that would be considered a variant reading. Okay, and see, part of the science of textual criticism is really just deciding between multiple readings which one is most likely the original.
Mhm.
And in the chapter, I kind of try to give people an idea of how that goes about, how that process works. And it's not specific to the Bible. This is done on any ancient text if there's more than one copy. And if you only had one copy, you can't do textual criticism. You just have to trust the copy, but you have no idea if it's reliable or not. It could be a really bad copy, and it's just the only one you've got. So it is an important approach. With those readings, I would say first off, yes, there are some that make a big difference to the text. Everyone's very aware of the really large ones. There's only two really main textual variants that everybody's always heard of, which is the longer ending of Mark and the woman caught in adultery in John. Okay, and
Mhm.
so those get a lot of discussions, but with those being present or absent from Mark or John make a big difference about how the text goes and sort of the flow of the text. In other ways, there are some passages that might seem like a minor variant reading, but do impact the reading of the text. A very popular one is whether or not in Romans 5 we are told that we have faith in God, or we have hope in God, or that we should have hope in God, right? And that or through Christ. Now that seems like a minor thing, but it's the difference between something, an assurance that you have this, or something that you should be striving towards. It makes a
Mhm.
theological difference. And so yes, so can make an impact. However, as you say, Barterman has at least acknowledged that there is no doctrine of the Christian faith that rises or falls on the basis of any textual variant that exists. And as my mentor, Dr. Gurry, has very effectively said, is that yes, there are absolutely textual variants that affect a reading about a doctrine of Christianity in that verse. But God was wise enough not to require that any doctrine of our faith relies on a single verse. So you might say, well, this passage, does it say the one and only God or the one and only Son? And how does that impact, Jesus as God or Jesus as Son? That's great, okay. But how many other places are there texts that also talk about Jesus as God or Jesus as the Son of God that have no textual variants? So you might find it in the first chapter of Mark that it has an issue there, but it doesn't have that issue in the rest of Mark, or Matthew or Luke or any of those. So yes, there might be individual places where a verse will be affected by the variant reading. But, again, praise God, none of our beliefs, none of the doctrines of Christian faith rely only on one verse. They are taught throughout the scriptures. And so it doesn't ultimately affect or impact anything that Christianity has believed since its inception.
Okay, very good. I don't mean to cut it off there. I just really quickly wrap up. We got 5 minutes. So these last two
Sure.
chapters, spiritual sin, pervading Christianity by Melissa Doherty. What's that sin she talks about in there again? The pervading
She's
sin is what?
approaching, so yeah. So Melissa's approach is dealing with a lot of New Age belief and that sort of thing. And
That's
so
right.
what she's dealing with primarily is the need for an emotional experience, which is increasing in a lot of areas, especially in sort of American Christianity. This need to feel something with God, otherwise you're not walking with God. And she really points out how that can be ultimately unhealthy and debilitating to a human being, both spiritually and physically. So it's a very
Right.
insightful chapter, yeah.
Yeah, I do see that. That does happen quite a bit. And then Natasha's chapter, raising kids with a confident faith in secular culture. Of course, she's the expert on that.
Yeah, she
Natasha's
is.
done a great job. She's been gracious to me in some ways too. So she really has gone to bat on that issue, and so that's just an overall kind of summary of what she's been talking about
Yeah, and
elsewhere.
she
Some
gives a lot of
tools in this book.
resources. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really helpful if you're a parent and or even with grown kids, but if you've got children, grandchildren, or neighbor kids, or anybody that you're dealing with in sort of youth, and she gives you some guidance, some places to look for help on how to raise them, how to give them confidence, how to let them feel free to ask questions and have doubts, and how to be as a parent or as a guardian to sort of respond to those things. And because it's one thing to have your kids ask you questions, it's quite another thing to be able to give answers to those questions. And so yeah, so she does an excellent job of giving you some helpful guiding tips and some ways to approach it, and then some resources to use. So yeah, it's a great way to round it out.
Well, it's like Frank says, there's either two things that are discipling your kids. This thing, your phone, your
Hmm.
iPhone, or it's you as parents and your local church. I mean, and to be
Yeah,
honest, today, most parents, the biggest challenge is this thing, our
yeah,
phones, because I gotta be honest. I mean, doing campus ministries are because I'll be talking to students, they'll just go right in their phone and Google something. You know what I mean? And then
yeah,
before I know, well,
yeah.
it says right here that there's textual variants and blah 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 blah. They
Hmm.
found a YouTube clip, and so
Yeah,
it's really hard today with the amount of information that's out there. And I think the
absolutely.
biggest thing with parents is we have to be able to teach our kids how to navigate that stuff and how to I really, really am burdened for reading. I just don't, it bothers
Mhm.
me that, a lot of kids, I don't want to stereotype everybody, but just they're on TikTok or
Yeah.
getting information
Yeah.
online. Like I call them the Cliff Note versions of things
Yeah.
online, and I just really think that if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, you got to be a reader. And I
Yeah.
just don't, it's frustrating to me that people just don't read books. I'm a book guy. I mean, I'll watch videos sometimes, but
Sure.
the point is that I think you've got to be encouraging kids to read, but it's hard today. As
It
attention
is.
spans are
No, you're
smaller,
right.
and so it's an uphill battle from there.
Mm.
Well, listen, I think this book is really well done, and I'm glad that Clark. I know you put a lot of work into it. You had to get a publisher. You had
Yeah.
to, that takes a lot of work to get that. Then you have editing, and I know I had my edits. I'm not the easiest guy to edit, I know, but anyway, but all this other work you've done on this. And so are you going to basically just, is your goal to be teaching full time New Testament? Is that your goal, to be a New
Um,
Testament
I, I,
scholar?
w- I would love that. I'm trying to we're trying to, as a family, trying to discern the next stage of ministry for us as we get to the end of this. Seems like the Lord might be calling us to be to academic ministry in underrepresented country. So we might be stepping into the mission field here pretty soon, and I would be teaching pastors in that context. So I would still be in an
Okay.
academic ministry, but in a place of need. So yeah, we'll be able to share more about that, I suppose, in our own social medias and personal threads here in the next few months, but that certainly is an option that we're looking at right now.
Well, please keep us posted on what you're doing. And everybody, if you can get a copy of Faith Examined, I know it's on Kindle for like 9.99. I'm a Kindle guy.
Yeah,
It's even
yeah.
cheaper there. I know the paperback's a little more expensive, but you can get it on Kindle. But
Mhm.
these are great chapters, and we certainly want to give our honor to Dr. Turek for all helping us with our apologetics ministries and all he's done. So, Clark, thank
Yeah,
you so much for putting this book together, and God bless you in
welcome.
all your studies. And please let us know how you're doing. But it's been a great discussion. So,
Yeah,
blessings to you in
thanks for having
Birmingham.
me.
Go
Yeah,
Duran
thank
Duran.
you.
I'll see you.
Yes, that's right.
See you.
And Ozzy Osbourne.
Ozzy
Bye.
Osbourne. Right, right, right. All right. You take care. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.